Hello everyone, this is Silent, and today I will be showing you how to set up fake audio occlusion using my Audio Manager package. This video is going to assume that you already have the Audio Manager installed. If you don't, you can check out installation instructions on my GitHub, but basically you'll be using the Creator Companion to install the package. Alright, in any case, let's get started. This world, of course, already has the package installed. And the first thing you're going to need to do to use the Audio Manager package is to create a new game object. I'm going to call it Audio Setting Manager. And to it, I'm going to add a Audio Setting Manager component. This is the main manager script that's going to handle everything that this package does. But additionally, it can be used to set the default audio settings for your world. You can set the voice gain, the near and the far range, and all these other options that VRChat allows you to set for people's voice settings. All right, now that we have the audio setting manager added, since today we're doing fake audio occlusion, we also need a second manager script for that. So I'm going to add a new game object, call it Audio Zone Manager, because to this one I'm going to be adding a Audio Zone Manager. This script here is going to be managing the audio zones for fake audio occlusion. The idea behind audio zones are that we're going to be defining zones in the world. If two players are in the same zone, or they share a zone, they're going to be able to hear each other. If two players do not share a zone, they're in different zones, they will not be able to hear each other. You can actually set the audio settings here for when you don't want players to be hearing each other. I actually like, personally, when players can still kind of sort of hear through very thin walls. And so I've set the voice range far here to 1.75. Just so if you're like really, really, really close to somebody on the other side of the wall, you can kind of make them out muffled. If you don't want that to happen, if you want absolutely no audio leaking through walls, you can just take this, set it to 0. I'll keep it at 1.75, however. All right, now that we have our two manager scripts in the world, let's set up this room with audio occlusion. We want it to be so that if somebody's on the inside, somebody on the other side of the wall will not be able to hear them. Let's do that. Let me click on this room, and to this room I'm going to create a new empty game object. I'll call this very creative name, Audio Zone 1. Why not? Or actually, I'll call it Room Audio Zone. All right. And to this, I will add a Audio Zone Collider. This room is fairly box-shaped, so I'm going to click Add a Box Collider, and it will kind of pop up a box collider automatically. The script supports auto-sizing box and sphere colliders. So if you add a box or a sphere collider using the script, it will try its best to auto-size those colliders. But in general, the script supports any trigger colliders. So that would include capsule colliders or even mesh colliders that are convex, because mesh colliders need to be convex for you to enable the isTrigger checkbox. But getting back to this room is fairly rectangularly shaped, so I'm going to be sticking with a box collider. Let's give this audio zone a name. And I'm going to set the zone ID. I'm going to call this audio zone room. And this actually is already going to do some audio occlusion. If I am inside this box, then I'll be able to hear other people that are inside this box. But if I'm outside of it, people would not be able to hear people inside or outside, and vice versa. So this is already going to be working. But of course, we have this little weird shape here. This room is not fully rectangular, and well, I don't want this corner to be in the audio zone. So let's fix that. I'm going to just shrink this like so. And let me duplicate and shrink this like so. And now we have two audio zone colliders that are all part of the same audio zone. So there are two separate colliders, right? This one in the back and this one in the front, that have the same zone ID. That is, these two colliders are going to be defining the same zone. So now this room is set up as one audio zone, and it's going to be isolated from the outside. All right, there are a couple of issues with this. The first one has to do with VRChat and how it syncs player positions. Basically, it's not perfect, and remote clients can easily end up clipping through a wall on your side. So, for example, if a player were standing really close to this wall over here, they sometimes clip through that wall and can then touch the audio zone on the inside of the room, even if they're on the outside of the room. To help with this, we can shrink the zone somewhat and kind of give a little buffer between the audio zone and the walls. I've added a little automatic shrink button that shrinks it by an amount that I found works pretty well most of the time. But you can also use these handles to kind of drag it around and kind of give a little space between the audio zone and the wall. In general, I find that usually giving extra space between the ceiling and the audio zone is a good idea when you have a building with multiple floors. This is because this effect of clipping through walls is actually greater. Players will clip through the floor more than they end up clipping through the walls. So you want to give a bigger buffer between the ceiling and the audio zone than the walls. All right, so this is looking pretty good. Let me just fix up the other one as well. I'll shrink that and move it around. Unfortunately, it is going to end up being a little bit fiddly, and that's just once again because VRChat syncing of remote player positions is not perfect. So you'll have to mess around with it and see what works for you. But in any case, this room is now set up. We now have a room. It has two colliders in it that are both pointing to the same audio zone. But there's still a problem, and that is that if I were having a conversation with somebody right outside this doorway, and I stepped right inside the doorway, I am now inside of this audio zone. And the person right outside the doorway does not share an audio zone with me, and so I will no longer be able to hear them. And this is pretty awkward, especially around doorways, where you definitely don't want it to be that one person on one side of the door can't hear the person on the other side of the door. So to solve this, we can use something called transition zones. I'm going to create a new empty and a new audio zone collider, and I'm going to call this transition zone. I could use a box collider here, but I've found that this works well with capsules, so I'm going to use a capsule collider this time. And I'm going to make sure that I'm going to check is trigger. Remember to check is trigger, so it's not an actual, so that it's a collider that players can still pass through. All right. Let us move the capsule collider into its spot. I'll make this a bit longer. It should not be vertical, it should be in the x direction. And I'll also give it a bit more of a radius, like so. and align it with our doorway. All right, that's looking pretty good. What does this transition zone do? The idea is that I'm going to take this transition zone and I'm going to give it actually the same ID that my room has. So I'm going to put room here in the zone ID. But in addition to that, I'm going to use the transition zone IDs. I'm going to add a transition zone ID right here. What these transition zone IDs are is basically a audio zone collider can have as many IDs as you want. So I could give it as many IDs as I want. And basically being inside a audio zone collider with extra IDs basically means you're inside of all of those audio zones at once. So if I had, and I can use that to create transitions between rooms. So for example, if I had two rooms, right, room 1 and room 2, I could have a transition zone between them with the IDs room 1 and room 2, and that would mean that I hear, that while I'm in this zone, I hear people in room 1, I hear people in room 2 at the same time. But of course here we just have one room, right? Here we just have one room, and we want a transition zone between the inside of this room and the outside, where there are no audio zones. In order to accomplish that, we'll just leave this transition zone ID blank. That is, we'll leave it as the empty string. The empty string, or the empty zone ID, is going to match a player that is in no audio zones. That is, it will match players that are outside. So now that I have this set up, while I'm inside this transition zone, I can hear people in the room because I have this zone ID, and I can hear people outside the room because I have the empty zone ID. And now this room is set up properly. So if I'm going to be having a conversation on opposite sides of this door, we will still be able to hear each other. But if a player is standing maybe around the back side of this wall, they will not be able to hear people inside the room because they do not share a zone ID. All right, that's the basics out of the way. Let's get into some of the, I suppose, some more details. Let's say we have not just one room in our world, we'll probably have more than one room. Let's say we have a second room over here. And we want to not be able to hear each other when we're in the two separate rooms. Well, right now, I have room 1 and room 2. And right now, these audio zones are sharing the same ID. And that would mean if I'm in this room, I would share a zone ID with this room, and so we'd be able to hear each other. We don't want that, so I'm going to give this a different name. Let's call this room 2. The audio zone IDs, of course, do not need to be unique, as you can see with the audio zone colliders. But if you want two zones to be separate, right, if you want two rooms to be separate, then the IDs do need to be unique. Because if the IDs are the same, you'll hear each other. If the IDs are different, you won't hear each other. That's basically what it boils down to. So try giving each room a different zone ID if you don't want people to hear into separate rooms. All right. Now that we have that, you can have, you might potentially have a room that is very complicated to set up, and you might be kind of putting a bunch of boxes, right, a bunch of different box colliders to fill out the special shape of your room. Well, there are two things you can do in that situation. The first thing is you can potentially use a mesh collider instead of multiple box colliders. I recommend against using a mesh collider. Mesh colliders are significantly less efficient than the primitive colliders, that is, box, sphere, and capsule colliders. They're significantly less efficient, but if you really need to, you can use a convex mesh collider. Just make sure to check is trigger. Alternatively, we can use negative zones if, and that sometimes can help us define audio zones better. So here, let me set up this room in a slightly different way. This room here, I've set up using two separate colliders on the inside. Over here, I'm going to do something slightly different. I'm going to copy this. And instead of having the, instead of sizing this properly and having a second zone on the inside, I'm going to instead pull this over here, pull that over there, and I'm going to set this as a negative zone. What this means is that while I'm inside this zone, it will negate the zones with the same ID. So while I'm inside the negative zone, it's basically kind of subtracts out the room 2 ID. So here I have this big zone here, and this smaller zone here, and the audio zone that makes up the audio zone that's going to make up room 2 is going to be whatever's inside this collider minus whatever's inside this collider. So I've removed this little corner. For this particular room shape, it doesn't make it too big of a difference which method you use, but for some oddly shaped rooms, it might be significantly easier to use negative zones on the outside rather than regular audio zone colliders on the inside. All right. Finally, one more thing. We have our audio zones in our rooms set up. Actually, I will copy the transition zone over because I forgot to do that. Let's add the transition zone over here. Call it room 2. All right. So we have our audio zones set up. There's one more step that we want to do for optimization purposes. Generally in a world, depending on how complex your world is, you might have a lot of audio zones. In the map that I use this in, there is over 1,000 audio zones, and you definitely don't want to be calculating collisions if you don't have to. And so what we can do is we can take all our audio zones and put them on a separate layer. You can do this by adding a layer in the Edit Layers drop-down here, but I've also included an editor script to do this automatically. So if you click on Tools, Asylum, Initialize Audio Zone Layer, this will find if you have an empty layer. Unity does have a maximum amount of layers, but it will find an empty layer index for you. And I can click Initialize Layer, and it will have initialized the audio zones layer. What I'm going to do is I'm going to go into my project settings. And if we navigate to the Physics 2D tab, you can see that the audio zones layer, we can set it up so that it only has collisions with player and player local. That means if you have like pickups in the world or other stuff that moves around, we don't want to be calculating collisions with that. We only want to be calculating collisions with the player. So I recommend setting up the audio zones layer to look like this. Now, at this point, I've already added some audio zones to the world, and you could go around and one by one change each of these to audio zones, but fear not. I do have an editor script that does this for you automatically. If I hit play, and we wait a moment, you will notice that all the audio zones have been set to the audio zones layer. and this happens automatically. So don't worry if you've already set up some audio zones. The moment you enter play mode or when you build the world, the editor scripts will automatically handle adding audio zones to the audio zone layer. And yeah, that is about it. Um, if you have any questions, you can reach out to me, um, and I can maybe take a look at your particular use case. But that's basically the short version. Of course, you can get a lot more in depth with the audio zone setups, but basically all it boils down to is fill the inside of the room with an audio zone, and have transition. And if you want transition zones between them, you can have zones with more than one ID. And if you want a transition zone to the outside, make sure to use the empty string to match players that are on the outside. All right, thank you for watching. Hopefully that helps setting up fake audio occlusion.